Good afternoon. I'm Christine Taylor Lewis, and on behalf of the Afro-American Historical Association of Fauquier County, I welcome you and thank you for your continued support of our mission at AAHA to gather, document, and preserve U.S. history, especially the history of African Americans in Fauquier County and its surrounding communities. Now, today marks the 10th in a series of conversations and presentations relating to our local genealogy and history. It is our hope and desire at AAHA that these virtual events will serve as a bridge leading to the extensive collection of historical data that is available in our museum, our library, and our research rooms, as well as the various social media outlets such as Facebook, YouTube, Zoom, and of course, our website at aahafauquier.org. On the website, you will find thousands of historical photographs, links to upcoming events, an enormous database, and our interactive story map with narratives and images that capture the origins of African American communities, churches, and schools in Fauquier County. So remember to visit us at aahafauquier.org. Now, during the months of May, June, and July, not only will our Zoom events focus on local family genealogy, but they will also take an in-depth look at some historical findings as they relate to the African American experience here in Fauquier County. Today, I am honored and pleased to introduce to you a young man whom I met last year at the Juneteenth celebration at Eva Walker Park, where he hosted a booth for the Fauquier History Museum. Now, while explaining to me some of the brochures and leaflets that were available, I could tell right away that he was keenly knowledgeable and genuinely sincere about what he was offering. Plus, he had a winning smile. Sean Redmiles was born in Fairfax and grew up in Manassas and Bristow, which is in Prince William County. Early in his adolescence, he found a passion for history. That enduring fondness led to an undergraduate degree in history and political science from the University of Mary Washington, and a master's degree in applied history from George Mason University. Sean has worked as a historic interpreter at the Ben Lomond Historic Site and the Bristow Station Battlefield. He also worked as a museum educator at 7 historical sites within the City of Alexandria. Since March of 2020, Sean served as executive director of the Fauquier History Museum at the old jail in Warrenton. However, he is currently head of the education team at Frying Pan Park in Herndon. Now, in today's event, Sean will give a local history presentation about freedom seekers and the Fauquier Old Jail. While he does not profess to be an expert on the subject of freedom seekers on a national level, he does affirm that he has done extensive local research. In fact, the bulk of his information is about the relationship between the jail and the inmates and the role the jail played in preventing the slaves from running away. Good afternoon, Sean.
Hey, Christine. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to Angela and Karen and to the whole AAHA. I got to work with Karen and Angela and Christine when I was at the Fauquier History Museum, and it was incredible. They were so helpful. They were wonderful for everything that I needed, including for this exhibit, which we'll talk about later. And I've been away from the jail now for a few weeks, and it's I'm definitely missing it. I like this new job, but I miss the sort of the everyday history that I got to do there. So I started at the Fauquier History Museum in March of 2020, and pretty quickly found a box of documents that I think had been gone through before by previous directors, but had never maybe been comprehensively looked at. Mm-hmm. And as I was going through them, I noticed a lot of entries for runaway slaves who were noted in the different accounts and ledgers that they had for the jail. There were various different, this person is in this cell, this person is in that cell, this person is being ironed, which means chained. And it was enough for me to wonder what was the relationship between the jail and runaway slaves, or as I prefer to call them, freedom seekers, which we'll talk about in a second. So that sort of question that I started to kind of think about for the first few months there turned into a larger research project with the hope of putting out an exhibit, which we did in April of 2021. So I think we started the research in October of 2020, and I'm going to take you guys through a few things here. We're going to talk about how I did the research, and this was through the help of some volunteers and an intern who helped me with this. We're going to talk about some of the sort of takeaways of what we found, stories, some pretty incredible stories that we found when we were doing this research. And then lastly, what the role of the jail was, and kind of putting into context what the sort of interaction was between somebody who's making this really difficult choice to run away to their freedom, and this institution that was designed in so many ways to prevent them from leaving their enslavement. So I think, Christine, we talked about it. I'll do kind of like through my presentation, and at the end we'll do questions. Is that right? Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
Thank you.
Awesome. All right, so first let's talk about the term freedom seekers. There have been so many words that have been used in history for people who are making this choice to run away, who are making this choice to escape for freedom. Fugitives, runaway slaves, those are all historical terms, and there's not necessarily anything wrong with them. But the reason why I like freedom seekers better is because it does kind of reframe the choice a little bit. When we use the term fugitive, when we use the term runaway, it does kind of connote, like a criminal act, which they were doing. I mean, this was a criminal act at that time to run away like that. But in our current day, when we're trying to think of the words that we want to use in order to sort of reframe how we talk about history, I really like freedom seeker better, because at its core, that's what they were doing. And it also, it kind of centers the language towards the action of what they're doing, which is seeking their freedom. It's not that they're seeking to be a fugitive. It's not that they're seeking to run away. They are seeking their freedom, right? They're taking this huge, enormous step towards freedom. So, if you use the term runaway, if you use the term fugitive, that's okay. But I just think for a presentation like this, and for future talks that I want to do about this, freedom seeker is generally the term that I'm going to use, unless I'm talking about in the context of a runaway slave ad or something that we've been talking about historically. So, all right, so let's talk about the research. So I'm going to quickly here come off of this presentation and show you guys a different screen, because I want to go to what we used when we were doing this research. So the number one site for me, and frankly, if you don't know about the site already and you're somebody who's very interested in researching history, this is something that you should have on your radar right now. I'm sure a lot of you already know about this, but for those who don't, this is called the Chronicling America Project with the Library of Congress. If you type Chronicling America into Google, you'll find it immediately. It is thousands, hundreds of thousands of newspapers that have been digitally scanned and placed into this database. And then I think the most important part is that they are keyword searchable using OCR technology. You can type any word into this database and it will find those words within those newspapers, which you can immediately realize is an incredibly powerful tool, right? So one of the major things that we did when we wanted to do this research is we just literally typed in Fauquier and runaway. And I'll do that right now just to show you guys. And again, we use the term runaway here because that's what we would be seeing in those newspapers. So we're gonna put that in there. I generally kept it to the period that the jail was open, 1808, until roughly the end of slavery, 1865. And then you just hit search. Oh, why did I not get anything there? Oh, I typed runaway in wrong. Okay. So you'll see that there were 189 hits when we did this. Some of these were duplicates. enslavers would often put multiple ads through multiple different newspapers when they were looking for their freedom seekers. So we went through every single one of these, and we came up with about 80 different unique stories, most of which we have in a Excel sheet that I have with me and that we used for this research. I'm actually planning on sending that to the AHA really soon. It's got to get cleaned up a little bit. It doesn't look the way that I want it to look, but it has the info in it. So this is an incredibly powerful tool for doing any kind of research. We obviously kept this specific to Fauquier, but if you're looking to do this for Prince William County, for Fairfax, for any county in Virginia, for any state within the South, I'd highly recommend this. Those ads give you a lot of information. We're going to talk more about them later on, but you can learn a lot about the choices that a freedom seeker is making and the lives of them just by reading those ads. And part of the reason for that is because enslavers were purposely being very detailed in those ads in a way that they aren't in any other records about their enslaved people. So it's a really, really valuable tool that I highly recommend for folks who are looking to do this kind of research. Another quick place that I would recommend to everybody is a database called Virginia Untold, and it's the Unknown No Longer database. Again, you can Google Unknown No Longer Library of Virginia, and this will come right up. This is not going to be exclusively freedom seeker documents. There's going to be a whole bevy of information about African Americans pre the Civil War, and actually some stuff post the Civil War, and life as an enslaved person. You can see there's public claims in here that have the names of enslaved people on them. There is information about the removal of enslaved people for various crimes or sometimes for sale. You can see that on there as well. But there are occasional ones in here that talk about people who are taken to jail for running away, or people who are confined in jail for a crime and then they escape from there, right? So there's a lot of really good information on this database. Honestly, even just outside of looking at freedom seekers, you'll find so much in here. When I did some research for Fairfax County, actually at the job I'm currently at Frying Pan Farm Park, we were doing research on slavery in Fairfax because we have a Baptist meeting house that allowed for enslaved people to worship there early on in the 1800s. That ended later on, but early on. And we were doing some research, and I used this quite a bit for that, which was really, really helpful. And then the last one is Freedom on the Move. This is a brand new database that they're actually still adding to, I think, every week. Every time they have something new, they are putting the advertisement into here. And it literally is advertisements. It's runaway slave ads from across time. There is, I guess they're over 10,000 now. I'm guessing that they're going to get that number much higher within the next year. This was literally put out just about 2 years ago. So it's very new, it's very recent. It allows for a whole lot of search choices. You can look by jail. You can go by dates, time. There is a lot of different options on here. So definitely recommend checking this out. We didn't end up getting a whole lot specifically from Fauquier for this. I want to say there's maybe one ad that came to us, but definitely worth checking out and seeing if this can apply to the research that you want to do around slavery, freedom seekers, anything like that. So, all right, let's come back to the presentation. So I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint. Oh, and I also wanted to bring up, I put it on here, I wanted to bring up the AAHA's Past Perfect Online website. If you haven't been, it's incredible. I actually spent the last year working on getting Past Perfect Online for the museum because I found the AAHA's database so helpful. It is their entire collection, documents, archive. You can go and you can search it. We did an Excel sheet just from that. And then I talked to Karen, and she also gave me some documents and files related to freedom seekers in Fauquier. So if you get the opportunity, go to that website and do some research using that. Okay, let's talk about some of the goals that I had for the exhibit. So I specifically wanted to find as many stories of freedom seekers as I could find. I wanted to know, how did they make this choice? What were the things that they were facing? Who is it that's making this choice? Is it younger people? Is it older people, women, men, right? And I think especially early on, I came to realize that I really wanted to highlight this choice as a bold, a risky, and a brave choice, right? So I think that every person who's ever been enslaved wants their freedom, of course. But there was a humongous risk that these people took to make this leap towards freedom. And we're going to talk about some of the risks that they were taking when they did this. But it was a bold stroke for freedom, right? It was going into an unknown, into danger, not knowing what could happen to you if you were caught, not knowing if you could make it safely to the north, and then not knowing what would happen to you in the north or what would happen to your family, right? And we'll go into some specifics on that. But I really, really wanted to highlight the boldness and the braveness of this decision because it wasn't an obvious choice. If it was, everybody would have done it instantly, but it was a difficult choice. It was a very tough choice that they had to make. I really wanted to talk about the specific interaction of the jail with freedom seekers, right? So what did the Fauquier County Jail, what was its role when it came to freedom seekers? It's obvious. It was there to prevent their freedom. But we get into a little bit more detail about that, right? It turns out there's kind of a lot more to it than just that. It fed into a system that interacted with slave patrols, with the courts, with the county offices. They all worked together to keep the system of slavery intact in Virginia. And we'll talk about how that operated based on some of the research that we did. Already talked a little bit about it as a bold stroke. One of the major things that we sort of came up with, and again, I can't generalize on the experience of freedom seekers in the United States. I can't generalize on the experience of freedom seekers in Virginia even. What I can do is give you guys some examples that we found that sort of show what that trigger point was for escaping, right? What was it that would push somebody to make this very risky, difficult choice? And actually, we'll go back 1 second and talk about why it is a bold stroke, right? So I said I was going to do that. We kind of have to think about it a little bit here, right? There is a lot of risk to this. There is the risk of imprisonment. If you get captured, there is the risk of being sold far away from your home and your community, right? Potentially never seeing your family again if you get caught and you're sold. There's the absolute risk of physical punishment. Enslaved people who made this choice and were caught were brutally punished for it. And that had to be a consideration for anybody who made this choice. You had to think about your family, right? If you're a father or a mother, taking young children on the road to the north was a really, really risky endeavor. But if you chose to leave them behind, would you ever see them again? Even if you made it to your freedom up north, there's no guarantee that you would be able to make it back south to free them. And so that was going to factor into your decision as well. Could young children survive on the road the way that an adult could if you decided to take them with you? All of these things had to come into play there. And then once they're on the road, they had to travel by night. They're not going to be able to take the main roads. They're risking starvation, thirst, exhaustion, freezing, difficult terrain, and then of course the ever-present threat of violence and of being discovered. So these are all things that make this, that risky, brave, bold decision. And all these are the reasons why usually there was some sort of trigger for why they would be trying to make the escape in that moment, right? And so one of the things that we found was the threat of sale. And in the 19th century especially, so the time period that the jail existed, I focused mostly on it being 1808 until 1860. This is when the interstate slave trade is beginning to grow and grow and grow to its largest heights. From 1810 until 1860, close to 1 million enslaved people would be forcibly moved from the upper South to the lower South. And these are two plantations in the lower South, cotton and sugar plantations, that are just killing for people who had to do that kind of labor. The average life expectancy was 7 years. And not to mention the chance of escape to the north when you were taken to Mississippi, Texas, Alabama, was essentially hopeless when compared to the chance of escape in Virginia. And enslaved people knew this. They knew who the certain traders were. They knew that if their enslaver decided to sell them, that they would likely not be seeing their family again for some time, that they were likely heading towards their death on a field in the lower South. towards a horrific lifestyle. And this could crystallize the decision in their minds typically. So if they had been thinking about running away before, the moment that they learned that they may be sold would be the moment that it was time to give it a try. And I, having read multiple secondary sources, this is just something that continually comes up for anybody who's done this research, that when a community learned that somebody was about to be sold, and they generally could find out before the enslaver was actually able to sell them, action would generally, they would take action pretty immediately. And running away was one of those tools that they had in their belt to try to avoid a pretty terrible fate. So one example that we have here is Lewis. So Lewis was committed to the jail of Alexandria, actually. This is from the Alexandria Gazette. James Campbell was a jailer for them in 1817. His name was Lewis, and he was bought from a Mrs. Hannah Brooke of Germantown. And he was bought by a Carolina trader. And the term Carolina trader in 1817, it doesn't necessarily mean that he was on his way to Carolina. It generally means an interstate slave, domestic slave trader. So these are people who are taking him out of the state, and he is on his way to potentially, I mean, if they're going to Alexandria, this likely means he's going to go on a ship with more than 150 other enslaved people packed in a compartment and make the long journey down the coastline up to New Orleans or Natchez, Mississippi, or potentially Charleston, as a sort of a second middle passage, right? This was the second middle passage in the United States. This traveled the interstate slave trade from places like Alexandria, Richmond, to places like New Orleans. So there were 4 traders in the company and a group of other enslaved people and covered wagons. He was about 25 years old. And it seems that he was able to escape and get away, and then was found and confined in the jail. And we can say pretty assuredly that the choice to run away was because of his impending sale and the fact that he's being taken out of the state to Alexandria, and potentially opportunity. 4 traders is a lot to be there with a lot of other enslaved people, but it's possible that he sees a moment and an opportunity that he was able to grab. So there might have been a lot in play there, but certainly his sale was an important part of it. Okay, then there's violent, or frequently really awful violence, that people who think that threat would choose. They had the opportunity. They would take the choice to run. So here's an example of a man named George, and this is true for a lot of different runaway slave ads, that they will often mention a scar or another sign of violence on their person. And so this is one way to sort of like see the brutality of slavery written through these ads. But it's interesting that when you read this, he says he has a scar upon his neck near the shoulder proceeding from a burn when a boy. The enslaver's making a point to say that this happened when he was a boy, but just the act of needing to say that at all makes me wonder if it was more recently and potentially the trigger for his escaping, right? We will never be able to know that, but there's, for the purpose of the ad, there's no reason for him to put that this came from when he was a boy, other than potentially the enslaver worrying that people thinking that he had enacted violence on him, and that's why he'd run away. So this is another major trigger for people, right? If there's a threat of physical violence, then they would say, then the choice might be more worth it in this moment. The risk might be more worth it. And then in some cases, people are fleeing for family. So this is an example of Charlotte. She ran away from the person who put this ad up near Auburn in Fauquier County. She was raised at Berry Hill, Culpeper County, and he believes that she could have gone to a number of different family members, a grandmother, Rachel, who was a free woman living near Mitchell Station in Fauquier County, a father and a sister who were still living at Berry Hill, and a sister near Auburn. And he says at one of which place she may be lurking. So what this tells me is a couple things. First off, we can see the effects of the slave trade right here. She has family members spread out all across Virginia, where they weren't sold on the interstate slave trade, but they were sold far away from where she was living. And, you know, Berry Hill, Culpeper is a long ways away from Fauquier County. She may have run away because she truly wanted to see her family again. She has a sister around Auburn. She has family living near Mitchell Station. This may have been a major impetus for her wanting to run away and take that risk, is that she wanted to see her family again and potentially believed that she could be safe with Rachel, who's a free woman, or her sister at Auburn. They could take care of her. They could hide her away. So there might have been some opportunity there as well. But this would be another trigger point for people to run away, is to see family members again that they would maybe not be able to see otherwise. All right. And so I want to also talk about one example of a story that we found. And I think this example highlights another trigger, which was just pure opportunity coming across your way, and the chance to seize that opportunity and get your freedom. So I said 1856 in here. It's actually 1854. So that's my bad. But this was a remarkable story that we found. The first thing we saw were a couple ads in the paper about this escape made on Christmas Eve by 6 enslaved people, and 2 of them who were from Fauquier, or I think 3 of them who were from Fauquier County. And then we found an account from William Still, who was a famous abolitionist. He wrote the Underground Railroad, which is filled with accounts of people who he helped get free. And this story, he mentions, he has like 2 pages on it. He goes into a great detail. So we know from the ads and from his account much of what happened during this escape attempt. So it was Frank Wanzer, Ann Wood, Mary Elizabeth, and Barnaby Grigsby. They left from a Loudon plantation with carriages, horses, weapons, and supplies, with the hope of making their way to Canada and freedom. So that point of it being Canada, this is 1854, is very important. Previous to 1850, enslaved people running away would be sort of searching for Philadelphia, Massachusetts, Maine. But in 1850, the Compromise of 1850 set in place a fugitive slave clause that gave much more teeth to slave catchers who were trying to find fugitive slave people, right? This basically meant that if you escape to the north, there is still a high likelihood that a slave catcher could come find you and bring you back to slavery in the South. So from 1850 on, enslaved people who wanted to run away, they would often have to choose Canada as their point, because that was the enforcing mechanism of slave catchers trying to find them was no longer applied to Canada. It was only within the United States. So Frank and Ann were from Fauquier County, and they left in that carriage on the night of Christmas Eve, 1854. They were met up by 2 men who are unnamed. We don't know their names, unfortunately, but one of them was from Fauquier County, we know for sure. And they went about 100 miles into Maryland, near they made it all the way up to Columbia in a driving snow. Part of the decision to leave on Christmas Eve was likely because on Christmas Day, many plantations had it in place that the one day of the year that enslaved people would not work was on Christmas. That's not true for every place. It's not true for every enslaver, but it may well have been true for this one, meaning that nobody would know they had left until December 26th. That's at least the likely thinking behind leaving on Christmas Eve like that. So about 100 miles into their journey, they were stopped by 6 white men and a boy who demanded to see their papers. And in the antebellum South, if you were an enslaved person traveling on the roads, you had to have specific papers signed by a white person that basically gave you permission to be going where you were going. It stated where you were coming from, and it stated where you were headed to. And if you did not have those papers, any single white person in the South had the authority to stop you and attempt to seize you to be brought to a jail, which we'll talk more about later. So that's what these 6 white men are doing. Frank Wanzer and his comrades realized that the moment has now come to fight, because there was no other option at that time. They pulled out a number of pistols and knives from concealment and declared that they would not be taken. So that's a quote, declared that they would not be taken. And this comes to us straight from that William Stills account. When one of the white men pointed a gun at Ann Wood and shouted he would shoot if they did not surrender, Ann yelled, quote, "Shoot, shoot, shoot." Still describes her as having a double-barreled, quote, "a double-barreled pistol in one hand and a long dirk knife in the other, utterly unterrified and ready for a death struggle." In the face of this, I mean, desperate bravery, the white men stepped aside and the four travelers rushed down the road. So this is a remarkable moment, right? They're choosing to fight because that's really their only option right now, and it works. I think the men who were facing them realized that that they would, you know, even if they were able to stop them, that they would be shot in the act of it, and that they were able to let them go forward. Unfortunately, for one of the 6 people who were with them, so there was 4 of them in the carriage and 2 riding by horse, the 2 who met up with them. One of those men was shot in the back when they were sort of separated from the carriage by these 6 white men, and he was brought to the Warrenton jail, where he was picked up by his enslaver, Charles Simpson. So that's one of the reasons why we know he's from Fauquier, because it says Charles Simpson was his enslaver from Fauquier County. But Frank, Anne, Mary, Elizabeth, and Barnaby do make it to Philadelphia, where they are greeted by William Stills. He further supplies them with food and what they need, and they make their way to Canada and freedom, where they were able to live out their lives. So this is an example of this going well, of a victory for people, for freedom seekers who are making this choice. And it also shows that, and we have many examples of this, that oftentimes enslaved people had to choose violence in order to get what they needed to in this moment, right? They had to fight for this moment of freedom, and we see that in several other instances that come up in the research that we did. I also want to mention quickly before I go into the next one that this escape attempt coincides with 3 other sort of mass escapes that happen in the beginning here in December of 1854 and all the way through to the fall of 1855. And in one of those ads, it's actually noted that the people of that area of Loudoun, Fauquier believe that there is somebody operating to free enslaved people and help them make their way to the north. Whether that's true or not, no way to know. Certainly, white people at the time had trouble giving enslaved people that kind of agency, that in their mind, there's no way they could have come up with that plot on their own. They had to have somebody helping them. And we know that that's not necessarily true, that they had a network of people that could help figure out a way to make this happen and then make the mass escape that they needed to make. But it is noteworthy that, you know, most of what we saw in our ads were individual people making their flight. But in this 1-year period, there does seem to be multiple mass escapes on different plantations at the same time. So even if there's not like a person from the north helping them, it can potentially tell us that there is communication happening across plantations, right? Communication happening across enslaved communities. And we know that this is true from other stories that we have across the South. So this may have been an instance of us seeing it here in Loudoun and Fauquier, that enslaved people were able to, across different disparate farms and plantations, figure out a means to escape and do it all at once, which is fascinating. And hopefully someday we can do a little bit more to figure out how that might have worked and how that might have operated. All right, and so now we're going to talk a little bit about the people who were attempting to stop them from getting their freedom, right? And this is where the jail is going to come into play. Virginia was a slave society, as was most of the states of the South, all the states of the South. And it had many systems in place to keep the enslaved from escaping. We've got, you know, there were slave patrols frequently combing the roads. As we talked about, any white person could stop a Black person to ask for papers, whether you were free or enslaved. And by the way, if you were a free person and you didn't have your papers on you, that could potentially cause you to be re-enslaved, because you did not have a lot of recourse in court. If somebody grabbed you, you didn't have your papers in any way to prove that you. So these laws are being continually strengthened, as we talked about in the instance of the Compromise of 1850, but even within the state of Virginia, they're being continually strengthened. and they are strengthening the power of slave catchers to find freedom seekers and bring them to their enslavers. And then, of course, we have the thousands of broadsides and ads, and every one of them is costing money. Every one of them is taking up print space, and every one of them is designed to communicate to the community that this enslaved person needs to be found and brought back, right? So this was a tool for the enslaver, a major tool in the toolbox of the enslaver to try to bring back their enslaved people. They were very detailed in these ads. They are putting them across, and this is one of the major things that we found, is that they're putting them across multiple newspapers. One of the things that made this research so hard is that we had, more than 200 hits, but so many of them were duplicates because they're putting it in the Alexandria Gazette. They're putting it in Washington, D.C. newspapers, in local newspapers in Fauquier, Warrenton. They're trying to cover every different area. And I think it also speaks to the value that they put in the bodies of these people, right? They're spending a lot of money because they have a lot of money wrapped up in bodies of those enslaved people, especially in, the average enslaved person in the 1850s was worth to an enslaver $800, which today translates to more than $20,000. And you can just see it when you're looking at these ads, how desperate they are to find them again and bring them back into enslavement. The rewards varied and could sometimes depend on age and the physical condition of the freedom seeker. They would also increase the payout based on where this person was found. So if they were found out of state, if they were found in the North, the reward was often higher. And you could understand the thinking there is that it's a lot harder to find somebody outside of the confines of Virginia. And so the reward would be more of an incentive for your interstate slave catchers to find them, which is essentially what often happened. Local, state, and national laws were designed to empower enslavers, even in free states. But it's worth noting, we'll talk about this in this next example, that with the rise of the anti-slavery movement in the North, the sight of slave catchers could create controversy. And we'll talk about that for this next example. So this is something that we found that I call the Wilkes-Barre incident. It's very, very interesting. Just like with the Christmas Eve story, we found this first through the ads. And then it turns out that multiple different heritage societies have written about this, especially in Pennsylvania, because it was such a big deal. What happens in this incident ends up becoming national news and involves multiple different court cases, and really speaks to the sort of the tensions that are happening between North and South in that 1850 to 1860 period, and how freedom seekers are involved in sort of pushing those tensions and getting us closer to a civil war that will lead to freedom. So on September 3rd, 1853, federal agents entered the Phoenix Hotel in Wilkes-Barre. That's what we're looking at right now. This is the Phoenix Hotel. And they attacked William Thomas, who was a Black man working in the hotel. He had actually escaped 6 years earlier in 1857 from Isham Keith. Many of us have likely heard of the Keith family. They were very prominent in Warrenton. Isham Keith, I think, was a judge at one point. And he essentially hires federal agents. He hires federal agents to go into Pennsylvania, find William Thomas, and bring him back into slavery. So he had been working in that hotel for 6 years. They get into a fight. William is struggling. He grabs whatever he can grab and tries to hit it over the head of the agents. There's a scramble. He's bloodied. He makes his way out of the hotel towards the Susquehanna River. And the federal agents are right behind him. They get to the river, and William Thomas attempts to make the crossing over to the other side of the riverbed. He attempts to swim across. And while this is all happening, while there's the struggle and the fight outside and all of it coming towards the river, a crowd begins to form of people, white and Black, from around Wilkes-Barre. And they are decidedly against the side of the federal agents. They are jeering at them. They're shouting at them. They're in some cases throwing stuff. And William Thomas, throughout all of this, is able to get across the river. He gets to the other side. He obviously nearly drowns, but he's able to make it. He's bloodied, he's bruised. A family on the other side takes him in and takes care of him, and he's able to make his way up north to Canada and freedom. So the story ends well for him. But for those 2 federal agents, the story continues. They're actually arrested by state officials, Pennsylvania state officials, and thrown in jail. And they get hit with the charge of inciting a riot. And the community is really pushing for this. The state is really pushing for this, but the South is infuriated because in their minds, this is a state intervening on behalf of federal agents who, in their mind, are enacting the law. And sadly, they were enacting the fugitive slave law that was in place before 1850 and sort of the rules that were then in place during the Compromise of 1850. But initially, the court of Pennsylvania rules in favor of the state and says that they didn't have enough evidence for them being there, that the way they went about it was wrong, and that they were inciting a riot. Ultimately, it's thrown out by the Supreme Court, but it inflames the South. You can see ads all across Virginia and North Carolina and South Carolina angrily talking about this moment and how is it that we can allow one state to stop the federal government from pushing something that is part of the law. I like to make this point because it is an important one when we talk about the Civil War and states' rights. Here is an instance where the South is very adamantly pushing for federal rights over the states and getting angry when a state is asserting that right over the federal government, right? So something that I really like to go into here. Also worth noting that this is just one small instance in a stream of freedom seekers that begin making their way north in the 1850s. And potentially because of that law in 1850 that allowed for slave catchers to go up further north, there are more instances of crowds coming out and angrily stopping slave catchers and newspapers covering a slave catcher is coming to our town and taking this person. And this cannot be allowed to happen within the confines of the United States. It inflamed tensions, which ultimately pushed us closer to the Civil War, which ultimately led towards freedom for freedom seekers. And by the way, during the Civil War, thousands of enslaved people fled plantations towards the Union lines, kind of disproving a point that Southerners often made that when push came to shove, the enslaved people would choose slavery over freedom, which seems insane to us today, but is actually something that they claimed when they would make cases for slavery, pro-slavery. And so I just like to point out that people like William Thomas helped propel us towards freedom by making this choice. He wasn't doing it, with that in mind, but he was doing it for his freedom, just like everybody else was. But it ultimately pushed us towards the Civil War and freedom for everybody. So an important point to make for men like William Thomas. All right, so let's talk about freedom seekers in the jail. Freedom seekers, yeah, we talked about how they faced many difficult choices and obstacles on their path to liberty. For enslaved Black Virginians, the walls of our jail, the Warrenton jail, of any jail, represented an end to hope, to what was a desperate dream. And for white enslavers, it represented a tool for the preservation of their wealth, which was bound in the bodies of those confined in the jail. And we really see that in these ads, and we see that in some of the laws that are put into place. So when a freedom seeker was lodged in jail, we know this from our jail records, they were chained to the floor or the wall using manacles. The part of the reason why we know who's in the jail is because they talk about that so-and-so was ironed today, and then the chains were taken off them, and then they were put back on. I think they have to charge it to the account because they're, I haven't been able to figure out exactly why this is, but I think they have to actually tear off the manacles and then build new ones in order to put people back on there. So through that, we know folks who are in the jail, but we also know that they were being chained. When they were in there, the jailer would actually himself often put out the ad across Virginia saying that this person is here. He claims that he was enslaved by this person, or that he's from this place, and that person needs to come and take them back. And if nobody came to claim them, then they were sold on auction, and the money would go for the county. Which is a really important point in sort of how this slave patrols, you've got slave white person walking on the road who can stop them and capture them. Then you have the jail who can hold them in place and prevent them from trying to make that escape again. And then on top of that, if for some reason the enslaver doesn't come, the county can sell them and make a profit off of that. And we also know that slave traders often frequented jails for this very reason, that when they could go to a local jail and see if there's anybody who had not been picked up in 6 months, purchase them for cheap from the county, and then sell them on the domestic slave trade for an enormous profit. And actually, Wendy Wheatcraft and I, who was a member of the board, we found an instance of a slave trader who operated out of Warrenton using the jail to hold a enslaved person that he had just bought and that he needed to kind of like keep in prison until he was able to sell them to New Orleans. So the jail was used for multiple different purposes beyond what it should have been used for, which was confining criminals. It was an important way to hold freedom seekers. And then I think this last point is the most important point for the role that the jail played. You can see in so many of these ads that they make clear that the reward is tied to the capture and the securing of a freedom seeker in jail. You can see it on all of them. It's not you get the reward if you capture this person. It's you get the reward if you capture them and they are secured in a jail. And at that time, there was no place like a county jail that people could feel comfortable confining somebody in and that they wouldn't be able to escape. So jails became the means by which slave catchers got their money. There is no, for most of these rewards, you did not get your reward unless the person that you found was brought into jail. And so they serve as the main means for not only enslavers to get back their enslaved people, but for slave catchers to continue their business and gain their reward money. And that's, I think, just like an enormous point that we found in all of this. Now, it's important, you know, one thing that we found too, and I want to go into these examples here, is that while being confined in jail generally meant the end to your hope for freedom, once you were picked up by your enslaver, it's very likely that they are that whatever opportunity presented itself to you at that time may never present itself again. That the enslaver is going to be more wary of attempts by you to make that escape. In some cases, we know that people were branded with the letter R to show that they had run away in the past, and it usually meant when you were confined in the jail that this was the last chance that you would ever have. However, we do have examples here of people who escaped from the jail, who had made that choice to run away, and then, you know, they're captured, and then they managed to make it again. They managed to find a way out and hopefully get to freedom. So this is one example of a man named Richard, who went by Richard Parker. He was committed to the, oh, and by the way, you can say, if taken, you can see here, if taken, he must be committed to some safe and convenient jail in the state. So again, there's that reward being tied to being sent to the jail. He escaped from the jail of Fauquier on the night of the 13th of last June, to which he had been committed as a runaway. And then it goes into great detail about his look and his demeanor and all these different things. I've mentioned it before, but enslavers were extremely detailed in these ads. And even though it's so that people can obviously identify them, but it's one of the main ways that we can get a sense for what these people look like, right? That's usually kept out of, they're not in census records. This sort of information rarely makes its way into wills, but we can see them in these ads. So he escapes from the jail on the night of the 13th of June, and I have tried my best to see if there's any sign that he was recaptured, and I have not found anything. So I like to think that he did make his way to the north on the second attempt. The Fauquier jail was known for being escapable. There's a quote in one of our documents that that no person of import has attempted to escape from this place without succeeding in the effort, which is just a really weird roundabout way to say that most people who wanted to escape were somehow able to. Here's an example of Jack, who escapes from the jail in 1819. Benjamin Lacken was one of our jailers, and he was committed to the jail as a runaway and broke jail on the 23rd of this month. He will give the above reward to any person who will deliver him to him at that place. And this is really fascinating because this is the jailer, in this instance, putting the reward on the capture of Jack. right? So this isn't the enslaver who theoretically is supposed to come and pick them up. This is the jailer himself. So could it be because they know that they could sell Jack for a decent amount of money if no one comes and picks him up in 6 months? There's a bunch. It could be because there's a lot of different reasons for why Benjamin Larkin himself is putting up that money. And one of the things I want to do in the future when I continue this research is figure out, more about what jailers were doing when it came to runaways, because they were also billed for the food and the clothing that they provided to a freedom seeker. And then they would take that bill and they would give it to the enslaver. But if no enslaver came and picked them up, then it would be paid out of the money that they used to sell them. So it may be that Benjamin Larkin had this person for some time and was willing to put up a reward because it would still ultimately help him pay off the expenses that he had for keeping this person in jail. There's no way to know for sure, but it does sort of speak to just how important it speaks to the system that was in place, right? That the jailer himself is putting this money up. And then just going back to, we had a couple examples of people who didn't escape, but who are confined in our jail. This is somebody named, does he not have a name? Oh, Ben, yeah, Ben, who belonged to William Garrett. He was committed to the jail in April 1834 when Robert Kemper was our jailer. And it has kind of like a description of what he had, and we don't know what happens to him after that. I have not been able to find anything, but oftentimes you can see in, there's a special document that talks about people who are sent to the penitentiary, and it may be that Ben was on one of those lists. So I'm trying to sort of figure out more about that into the future. This one's a little hard to read, but you can see James English was a jailer for us in the 1820s. And this is for Bob, who was committed in 1825 from Prince Edward County. So here's an example of somebody, that's right, that's why I wanted to put this in here. He is from Prince Edward County, but for some reason is making his way to Fauquier County. No way to know what exactly the reasoning behind that was, but the jail didn't just serve people from Fauquier County, it served any county who was looking for their freedom seekers. It was a place to confine somebody until they could be moved to another location. All right. And that's essentially the end of my presentation, guys. I wanted to go into all those different points and finish with the particular role that the jail played. Thank you guys for giving me the opportunity to talk about this. As you guys can probably tell, there's a lot more research to be done about this. And a lot more to
Yeah, I'm looking at it now.
more to find out, and sure it's, and if you haven't museum and it, we go into a lot of these stories.
Okay, we have some questions from the chat room.
Yeah, you can throw it on the chat too. Yeah, if you guys have any questions for me.
Well, there's a question about the History Untold, whether or not that was with the Library of Virginia.
It is with the Library of Virginia. That's correct. Yeah, it is. Yeah, Virginia Untold. Yeah, with the Library of Virginia. So yeah, if you just type in "Unknown No Longer" or Virginia Untold, you'll find that database. From my understanding, they went through all of their records that they had and just looked for any record that had mention of an enslaved person, a free Black person, and then they put that document online for us to look at. So it's remarkable. It's one of the best resources that we have for finding out about the experience of being a free Black person in Virginia and being an enslaved person in Virginia, and the different instances that come up. I mean, there's so much in that database. There's things that I didn't know until I started looking at them. For instance, there's a story of a woman who, there's actually a couple different stories of people who got their freedom and then realized that there was a law in place that had been put in place in 1808. Many of you guys maybe know this, that essentially said that a year after you were freed, you had to leave the state of Virginia. And some people put in a petition to the legislature to try to get an exemption to that. But some people, there wasn't really any hope of that happening. And so they had a very difficult choice to make if they had a family that they needed to stay with. And in the instance of one woman, we actually found that she chose to be re-enslaved, but with a deal from her enslaver that she would essentially be free. But because she couldn't be free and stay in the state, she, under the law, became re-enslaved, but then lived more or less as a free person. So it's a really fascinating loophole that kind of came in the late 1850s and was used by her and several other people. And you can see it in that unknown no longer database under Fauquier. So if you look around, you'll find it in there. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Angela raises a question about the sketches, whether or not we know who did those sketches.
Yes. Yeah. Let me go back to those. Those are really good. So this one in particular is from William Stills's Underground Railroad. And I can't believe I didn't mention this. This is believed to depict the moment that Ann Wood, Frank Wanzer, Mary Elizabeth, and Barnaby make their stand outside of Columbia in Maryland. So this is that scene of them pulling out the dirks and the pistols and trying to make their way to freedom. So it's kind of like, I think it was chiseled in wood. It was in the Underground Railroad, and it was made in 1871 when the book was published. What was the other one? This one is a famous one from Harper's Weekly. It shows, I believe this is New Orleans. And it was, obviously, I think drawn up by an abolitionist group, an anti-slavery group, to show the evils of slavery. And I have used it a lot of times when talking about the domestic slave trade, because it is one of the best period sketches that you can find to show just how awful a moment that sale was, right? If people aren't thinking about it, they're not thinking about a daughter being torn from her mother. But here is the sketch showing that for people, and it's from that time. So I use this whenever the information about the domestic slave trade comes up.
Okay, we have time for one more. Terry Osley asked, are you aware of any connections to the Underground Railroad or a network to assist escaped slaves?
Yeah, so I think that we didn't find anything other than that, and this is something that that Karen and I have talked about, that Karen pointed out to me a sort of mass escape that happened across several different plantations. You can see the advertisement has like 6 different names on it, and most of them are all from different places, which is remarkable. Again, like I've looked at a lot of these ads from Fauquier at this point, and I can tell you that not many of them involved multiple people. It's usually just one leaving at the same time. And then looking back, after I sort of heard this from Karen, I kind of looked back at my database and I saw, in 1855, there's actually several instances of multiple enslaved people, including the Christmas Eve escape, happening at the same time, leaving the plantation. And then there's that one little mention in one of the ads of I think they said like an agitator who is potentially helping these people escape. Again, I want to point out that there's certainly a chance that the Underground Railroad was involved in that. But I also don't want to necessarily take away from the possibility that they were doing this themselves, because I sort of don't always love the idea that it's like, oh, a white Northerner came in and helped people get free, when oftentimes, like I spoke earlier, there's large numbers of within the community, there's large numbers of people who are talking across plantations, sometimes even across counties, and working together to take that opportunity for freedom. So it's possible that that's what's happening, but we just have to do more research to find out. And I'm sure we can find something else that can make the connection between all these different incidents within a 1-year period. So
yeah, there was a comment that the Quakers would often hold abolitionist views.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly if you'd had contact with someone on the Underground Railroad and you knew the places that you could go to be safe, then it made that choice a a little bit less risky in theory, right? If you knew that you could go somewhere and be kept and then go to the next place, the next station, the next station, the next station,
Right.
it made it easier for those mass escapes to be possible.
Right, right. I have one more for sure.
Okay.
Do you know if the stone slab next to the old courthouse, this is coming from Deborah Copeland,
Yeah.
was an auction space for enslaved people? A lot of
So,
people raise that question.
yeah, a lot of people raise that question. And we actually thankfully have a definitive answer now. Yeah, or at least we feel like it's a pretty definitive answer. We think that almost certainly it was not. And we can tell you a couple reasons why. For starters, when people were sold from the county, they were sold on the steps of the courthouse. There really wasn't like a just kind of as we talked about earlier, there really wasn't a separation between the county government and the slave trade. I think in the 21st century, there is a sort of a narrative that's come out from the 19th century that slave traders and the slave trade was kind of looked down upon and was sort of like the dregs of society, and people generally didn't engage in it, and it wasn't really a big part. That is unfortunately not true. And we've been doing research on a slave trader who operated out of Warrenton, who was a very respected member of Warrenton society. And he worked for two men who were some of the wealthiest men in Virginia, and they were considered well-respected men of society. The county sold people, just like we talked about. They sold people out of the jail. So they almost certainly, in almost every county that I've ever heard of, they were sold from the courthouse steps, and there wasn't necessarily some specific auction block. The other thing about it is that we actually found that not only is that not the location of where that particular stone used to be, we've seen it in other pictures from like the turn of the century. We're pretty certain that it was a like wagon carriage point, or like we see it next to like an electric pole in like 1910. And it's like at the corner of Main Street and Winchester Street at one point. So I think we can say with some certainty now that it was not a slave auction block, and that when people were sold, they were sold from the county steps.
Okay. Well, we thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. And we thank you so much for sharing this remarkable piece of work that you've done in the research.
Thank you, guys.
Appreciate it, and we know that there's much learning from this. And we hope to see you again sometime soon.
Yeah,
Wish
absolutely.
you the very best and congratulate you on your new position there.
Thank you, Christine. I appreciate it. I appreciate everybody having me. And if you have any more questions, you can email me. Karen has my email. I'd be happy to answer them. And I want to continue with this in the future and do what I can to find more information about freedom seekers and this difficult subject. So thank you, guys.
Thank you, Sean. Wonderful.
Thank you. Beautiful presentation.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.
Now, next month, on June 14th, in celebration of AAHA's 30th anniversary, we will host Dr. Deborah A. Lee, who's an independent historian, and she'll give a presentation on Virginia immigrants to Liberia and the Henderson Appeal. So we actually look forward with excitement to what she will bring to us, in great anticipation of learning a great deal. And then on the 28th of June, Stephanie Addison Mudd, who has been here before, she's a local family historian, and she'll return and give a presentation on the Blackwell community in Midland. And there are many, many African-Americans in Fauquier who have direct ties or whose roots spring from the Blackwell farm. So we're excited about having her as well. And again, we thank everybody for your support and your presence here today. And have a blessed week until we see you the next time.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.